You know, the word racist to me remains a kind of a loaded word. It means different things to different people. If you define it as being somebody who's insensitive to people on the basis of race, then I would say, yeah, he's a racist on that definition. But does he always do every single thing that you can point to against blacks? No, he doesn't. I mean, he voted in favor of Eric Holder's nomination to be an attorney general. He voted to extend the Voting Rights Act in 2006.
So it's 2006 when Congress reauthorizes the Voting Rights Act.
Correct.
Then you have Barack Obama win the presidency twice. I find it interesting that the Citizens United decision comes about a year after he's inaugurated the first time. And then you have the gutting of the Voting Rights Act 6 months after he's inaugurated the second time.
With respect to voting rights, there are 5 justices on the Supreme Court who thought the Voting Rights Act had outlived its usefulness. They're not supposed to act like a legislative body. They're supposed to defer to Congress. And Congress had done an investigation of tens of thousands of pages to show that discrimination in voting was still sufficiently high that the Voting Rights Act was justified. And the Supreme Court, in just one decision, a 5-4 decision, nullified that. And I just think that was an example of the Supreme Court really acting like a political body rather than a judicial body.
Jane Mayer of The New Yorker wrote an article about the last time we transitioned from a Democratic to a Republican Justice Department and the hiring of Hans von Spakovsky. He worked in the same department that you worked in previously in the Department of Justice, and I wonder if you could comment on his tenure there.
Well, what happened in the George W. Bush administration was the Justice Department became, to the core, politically corrupt. Even line attorneys were selected on the basis of political affiliation or partisanship. The department had never been that way under Ronald Reagan. It had never been that way. It had never been that way under George H.W. Bush. And even I was hired under the Nixon administration. It wasn't even that way then, because if it had been, I wouldn't have gotten a job in the Nixon administration. So I think what happened during those years in the Civil Rights Division was tragic. You had many career attorneys forced to leave, and a lot of vote suppression efforts, frankly, were undertaken during that period. And I think as a result of that, when Mr. von Spakovsky was appointed to the Federal Election Commission, all of that record from his days in the Justice Department really came back to haunt him, as they should have, and his nomination was withdrawn. I would say that I'm really concerned about that happening again this time, because the Justice Department for the last 8 years has been on the side of voting rights.
The justification for voting restrictions actually grew out of our Department of Justice, spending who knows how many of our taxpayer dollars to look for voter fraud, create the fear that there might be voter fraud, not find any voter fraud, and yet still, after 235 years without voter ID, we started to implement those laws.
In the 2000 era, post-2000 era, many of the states were sent draft legislation by ALEC to enact photo ID laws. And it's such a myth out there, not only of voter fraud, but it's also a myth that everybody today has a photo ID. Sure, I have a photo ID, people like me have a photo ID, but there are hundreds of thousands of people, say in Texas, 660,000, who we proved don't have a photo ID, and we're going to be affected by the photo ID law that they passed.
Do you think that there are conservative justices on the court today who might regret Citizens United and Shelby v. Holder, which gutted the Voting Rights Act?
I do think there are justices on the Supreme Court who regret Shelby County and who regret Citizens United. I can think of 4 of them by name. I'm hoping that there's a 5th.
Right.
And I do think what we've seen are that the assumptions in Citizens United that were made by the court, which is that, first of all the spending would be independent and all of the spending would be disclosed, neither one of those assumptions turned out to be true. They were naive at the time, and we told them so, but the decision was rendered. Then a few years later, the McCutcheon decision came along, and in that case, we pointed out to the court before the decision that what would happen if they struck down the cumulative limits, multi-year limits for how much you could contribute to parties, that the parties would establish these state committees and that all of these funding mechanisms would be put in place, and so that it would be possible for somebody to actually donate upwards of $1 million. And the court said that that was, imaginary. It turns out that's exactly what was done. So I do think that, we have to hold the Supreme Court just as accountable as we hold Congress.
They also said that the public was not going to lose confidence in our elections if they allowed this flood of money, and clearly that has happened on both sides of the political aisle. So can you name one of the 4 conservative justices that are on the court today who might actually consider additional evidence even after having ruled as they did in 2010 and 2013?
I think the Chief Justice John Roberts and I think Anthony Kennedy would both be open-minded to new evidence that some of the assumptions in Citizens United and even the assumptions they made in Shelby County were incorrect and not factually based, because we now have a record of what's been happening. And we do see that the American public, I mean, the whole language about drain the swamp, all that language is about Washington, D.C. being corrupt with big money and dark money. Yeah. And so I think that, we've seen a lot of dark money. We've seen a lot of big money. And I think they'd be concerned about the fact that as a result of a decision they've rendered, we've turned our democracy into an oligarchy. I think that would bother them. It would certainly bother me.